Picture this. The year is 1191. The hot sun beats down on the walls of Acre, a city at the heart of the Holy Land. The Crusades have dragged on for years, a brutal war of faith and power. The air is thick with the stench of sweat, rotting bodies, and the iron temps of blood. The banners of the cross fly above the Crusader camp, and at the center of it all stands a king whose very name has become legend. Richard the Lionheart. But on this day, Richard will not be remembered for gallantry or chivalry. He will be remembered for an act so merciless, so horrifying, that it still stains his reputation 8 centuries later. Because here, outside the gates of Acre, nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, men, women, and even children are bound and kneeling in the dirt. Their lives hang by a thread, waiting for one man's command, and Richard gives it. With a single gesture, the Lionheart orders his army to slaughter them all. When we think of medieval kings, we often picture glory, honor, knights in shining armor. Richard I of England is one of those figures painted in romantic colors. The fearless crusader, the warrior king, the embodiment of Christian valor. But peel back the legend, and you'll see the darker truth. For in the Middle Ages, kingship was not just about honor, it was about fear. And fear was written in blood. The massacre at Acre is one of the most infamous acts of medieval cruelty, not just because of its scale, but because of its cold calculation. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't the heat of combat. It was a deliberate performance, staged for maximum effect. Designed to terrify enemies and send a message that Richard was not a man to be trifled with. But how did it come to this? Why did thousands of prisoners of war end up kneeling before a death sentence? To understand, we need to step back into the brutal reality of the Crusades. The siege of Acre had dragged on for 2 bloody years. Crusader armies from across Europe, English, French, German, had encircled the city, trying to wrench it from Muslim control. Inside the garrison loyal to Saladin, the great Muslim leader, held firm. The suffering was unimaginable. Famine, disease, corpses piling at the gates. Finally, in July 1191, Acre surrendered. The Christian banners were raised and the defenders, exhausted and beaten, laid down their arms. And here was the critical point. When the city fell, thousands of Muslim prisoners were handed over to the Crusaders, including nobles, soldiers, and ordinary citizens. Normally, prisoners of war were ransomed or exchanged. Saladin himself had offered to pay enormous sums for their release, as well as return captured Christian relics. Negotiations went back and forth, but Richard grew impatient. Some chroniclers say Saladin delayed paying. Others suggest Richard never truly intended to negotiate. What is certain is this. By August 20th, Richard had had enough. The prisoners were dragged out of Acre, tied together in long lines, marched to a hill where Crusader soldiers waited. The execution was not done in secret. It was performed in full view of Saladin's army, camped on the nearby hills, forced to watch as their people were systematically butchered. Richard wanted witnesses. He wanted horror. He wanted fear. Imagine the scene. 3,000 men kneeling, heads bowed, the soldiers raising their swords. The first strike comes, then another, its heads rolling in the dust. The screams of the dying mixed with the chants of Crusader priests. The earth itself, soaked in blood, as wave after wave of executions continued, hour after hour. Chroniclers tell us the killing lasted the entire day. By nightfall, the ground was piled with corpses. Richard had made his point. For some, this act was justified a punishment for Saladin's delays. For others, it was nothing short of a massacre. Muslim chroniclers wrote of it as a barbarity beyond words. Even some Christians were shocked at the scale of the slaughter. But for Richard, it was a demonstration of power, a warning to Saladin, a declaration that he, the Lionheart, would not be defied. And yet, here's the haunting question. Was this act one of ruthless necessity or one of cold-blooded cruelty? Because Richard was not the only king to commit such an atrocity. A little over 2 centuries later, another English monarch, Henry V, would order a similar massacre on the fields of Agincourt. But that story is for later. For now, we stand on the blood-soaked earth outside Acre, where one king's decision left 3,000 corpses as monuments to his will. This is just the beginning of our journey into the night, when thousands died by a king's command. Stay with me, because what drove Richard to this moment, and how history remembers, it will change how you see medieval kings forever. The massacre at Acre did not happen in a frenzy. It wasn't chaos. Nor was it the product of drunken rage. No, it was deliberate, organized, and brutally efficient. That is perhaps what makes it so chilling. Richard the Lionheart, one of Europe's most celebrated kings, made a calculated choice to execute thousands of men, women, and children in cold blood. So what? The answer lies in the deadly game of medieval power. A game where mercy was weakness and hesitation could cost you everything. When Acre fell in July 1191, Richard faced a problem. The Crusaders now held thousands of Muslim prisoners, and among them were high-ranking captives whose lives carried enormous political weight. Saladin, the great Sultan of Egypt and Syria, wanted them back. He offered to ransom the prisoners for gold, supplies, and even the return of relics sacred to Christians. On paper, it should have been simple: release the captives, receive payment, and strengthen the Crusader position. But negotiations dragged on. Saladin delayed. Some say he stalled deliberately, buying time to regroup his forces. Richard, never known for patience, grew suspicious. To him, every day the prisoners remained alive was a liability. Thousands of mouths to feed, thousands of potential rebels, and above all, a dangerous bargaining chip in the hands of his enemy. Richard's solution was as ruthless as it was simple. Remove the liability. Remove the bargaining chip. Remove the prisoners. And yet, this wasn't only about practicality. It was about theater. Richard knew Saladin was watching. Muslim armies camped on the hills outside Acre could see everything that happened. And Richard intended to send them a message written in blood. I am not here to play games. I am here to conquer. So, when Richard gave the order to execute all 3,000 captives, he made sure it was done publicly. Chroniclers describe how the prisoners were marched out in columns, tied together with ropes, lined up in sight of the enemy. Then the slaughter began. Think of what that looked like from the other side. Imagine being one of Saladin's soldiers, helplessly watching as your people were cut down by the thousands, unable to intervene. Imagine the rage, the despair, the fear. That was the point. Richard was not simply killing captives. He was performing an act of psychological warfare. But here's where it gets complicated. Richard was not alone in making this decision. The Crusader army was a patchwork of forces from across Europe. English, French, German, Italian. Not everyone agreed with the massacre. Some chroniclers even suggest that Richard's ally, King Philip II of France, looked on in horror. To many, this was not the act of a Christian king, but of a butcher. And yet, among Richard's supporters, the massacre was framed as justice. Saladin had delayed too long, they argued. He had failed to meet his side of the deal. The prisoners were simply paying the price. In their eyes, Richard was not cruel. He was decisive. This is the paradox of medieval kingship. The same act could be seen as monstrous cruelty by one side and righteous justice by another. What mattered most was not the morality of the act, but whether it achieved its purpose. So, did it? In the short term, yes. The massacre terrified Saladin's forces. It showed that Richard was ruthless, that he would not hesitate to use overwhelming violence. It also freed the Crusaders from the burden of feeding and guarding thousands of prisoners. For a moment, Richard's reputation as the Lionheart, fierce, unyielding, grew stronger. But in the long term, the massacre carried a darker legacy. Muslim chroniclers recorded it as a barbaric slaughter, fueling hatred that would echo for generations. Even some Christian writers, uncomfortable with the scale of the bloodshed, described it with unease. The stain on Richard's reputation was permanent, and perhaps most importantly, the massacre failed to break Saladin. If anything, it hardened his resolve. Far from weakening his enemy, Richard may have only enraged him further. This is the chilling truth about power in the Middle Ages. Kings often believed cruelty would secure their reigns, but cruelty had consequences. Richard may have ordered the deaths of 3,000 captives, but he could not control how history would judge him, and he was not alone. 2 centuries later, another English king, Henry V, would face a similar dilemma at the Battle of Agincourt. His decision would mirror Richard's in blood and brutality. But before we turn to Henry, we need to look deeper at what this massacre reveals about medieval kingship itself. Because in this world, a crown was not just a symbol of glory, it was a license to kill on a scale we can barely comprehend. 2 centuries after Richard the Lionheart's bloody order at Acre, the cycle repeated. Another English king, another battlefield, another decision that would leave the ground drenched in blood. This time the scene was not the blazing sun of the Holy Land, but the muddy fields of France. The year was 1415, and the king was Henry V. If Richard is remembered as the Crusader king, Henry is remembered as the warrior poet, the man Shakespeare immortalized in stirring speeches about honor, glory, and brotherhood. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. It's an image of noble kingship that has endured for centuries. But strip away the poetry, and Henry's rule was soaked in just as much blood as Richard's, and at the Battle of Agincourt, Henry ordered a massacre that mirrored his ancestors' cruelty in chilling detail. October 25, 1415, the Feast of St. Crispin. The English army, weary and starving, stood against overwhelming odds. They had marched hundreds of miles across France, battered by hunger and disease. Facing them was a French force far larger, stronger, and well-rested. By all accounts, Henry should have lost, but fate and mud were on his side. When the battle began, waves of heavily armored French knights charged across a narrow field, churned into sludge by rain. They bogged down, became easy targets for English longbowmen, and chaos spread. By the end of the day, the French army was shattered. Against the odds, Henry had won one of the most famous victories in English history. But victory brought a new problem. Thousands of French prisoners, many of them high-ranking nobles, now filled the English camp. Capturing nobles was usually a blessing. They could be ransomed for fortunes, enriching the captor and funding the war. Killing them was almost unthinkable, and yet Henry gave the order. The chroniclers describe it with brutal clarity, fearing that the captured nobles might rise up against their guards, or that fresh French forces might strike and free them. Henry commanded that the prisoners be executed immediately. The English soldiers, stunned, hesitated. Many did not want to lose the chance at ransom. Others balked at the sheer scale of the bloodshed. But Henry was resolute. The order stood. Groups of prisoners were marched out, cut down, and left sprawled in the mud. Chroniclers estimate that several thousand French captives were slaughtered in cold blood, their noble titles offering no protection against the king's command. The massacre at Agincourt was not as large as the 3,000 killings at Acre, but it carried the same chilling message. A king's authority was absolute, and mercy was expendable. Here is where the parallel with Richard becomes unavoidable. Both kings, faced with thousands of captives, chose the sword instead of mercy. Both justified it as necessity. Richard to break Saladin's will, Henry to secure his fragile victory. Both knew the act would horrify their enemies. Both did it anyway. And just as with Richard, Henry's decision left a stain. French chroniclers wrote of the massacre with outrage, portraying Henry not as a noble king, but as a butcher. Even some English sources admitted discomfort at the act, though Shakespeare centuries later would conveniently omit the bloodbath from his glowing portrait. This is the irony of medieval kingship. The legends we inherit are often cleansed of the blood, polished into tales of honor and glory. Richard the Lionheart, Henry the Valiant, both remembered as heroic figures, yet both left fields of corpses in their wake. And so, we are left with a question that echoes through both stories. Were these kings acting as cruel tyrants, or as ruthless pragmatists? From one angle, Richard and Henry's massacres were cold-blooded atrocities, acts that violated even the brutal norms of medieval warfare. From another, they were strategic necessities, removing liabilities, striking terror, ensuring survival. But whichever interpretation you choose, the result is the same. Thousands of men butchered not in battle, but in calculated executions ordered by their kings. This is the reality of medieval monarchy. Behind the crowns, behind the legends, behind the stirring speeches and romantic tales of crusades and victory, there was blood, rivers of it. And the decisions of a single man could determine the fate of thousands with a gesture, a word, a command. As we move deeper into this story, we must ask, how do such acts shape the way history remembers these kings? And perhaps more hauntingly, how many other monarchs hid their cruelty beneath the glitter of legend? What lingers after a massacre? The screams fade, the bodies rot, the blood seeps into the ground, but memory endures. Or at least the version of memory that survives the pen of the chronicler. And here lies one of the strangest truths of medieval history. Kings could shape their legacies not only with the sword, but with the stories told afterward. Richard the Lionheart and Henry V, two English kings, separated by 2 centuries, yet bound by their shared decision to kill prisoners en masse. Their massacres at Acre and Agincourt shocked contemporaries, horrified enemies, and troubled even some allies. But the way these acts were remembered tells us as much about politics and propaganda as it does about the events themselves. For Richard, the massacre at Acre became a point of fierce debate. Muslim chroniclers recorded it as one of the darkest atrocities of the Crusades, an act of barbarism that confirmed the cruelty of the Franks. They described in graphic detail how men, women, and even children were cut down before the walls, their bodies left to rot under the Levanten sun. For them, Richard was not the noble Lionheart, but the butcher of Acre. Christian chroniclers, however, were divided. Some defended Richard, claiming Saladin had failed to honor his promises, and that the captives were killed as a just punishment. Others admitted unease, portraying the massacre as a grim necessity rather than a glorious triumph. What is striking is how quickly the narrative shifted. Within a generation, the story of Richard's cruelty was softened, overshadowed by tales of his bravery, his duels with Saladin, and his status as the heroic Crusader king. The blood of Acre was still there, but for many, it became a footnote, not the headline. Henry V faced a similar rewriting. French chroniclers seethed over the massacre at Agincourt, branding Henry a butcher who had betrayed the knightly code of chivalry. After all, these were not nameless foot soldiers. Many of the slain prisoners were noblemen, some of France's most important families. To slaughter them was not only brutal, it was dishonorable, a violation of the rules of war as they understood them. But in England, the story took a very different turn. Chroniclers praised Henry's discipline, his piety, his miraculous victory against overwhelming odds. The order to kill the prisoners was acknowledged, but often downplayed as a practical decision in the heat of battle. And centuries later, when Shakespeare dramatized Agincourt in Henry V, he omitted the massacre entirely. Instead of showing a king who ordered blood in the mud, he gave us a king who spoke stirring words of brotherhood, unity, and divine destiny. And so Henry's legacy was polished until it gleamed, the slaughter hidden beneath the varnish of literature and legend. This selective memory tells us something unsettling about medieval power, and about human memory itself. We remember what we want to remember. Victors shape stories, kings commission chronicles, and the worst stains can be scrubbed clean if the legend is bright enough. Think of it this way. If you stop a stranger on the street and ask about Richard the Lionheart, they'll likely recall the Crusader king, the warrior in shining armor, perhaps even his role in Robin Hood legends. But how many would mention the 3,000 captives he had beheaded at Acre? If you ask about Henry V, you may hear about Shakespeare-stirring speeches or the triumph of Agincourt. But how many know that victory was followed by a mass execution of helpless prisoners? That forgetting, that softening of cruelty, is no accident. It is the product of centuries of storytelling, myth-making, and deliberate silence. And yet, the blood is still there, hidden in chronicles, in Arabic accounts of the Crusades, in French records of Agincourt. We can dig it up, examine it, expose it. And when we do, the legends of these kings crack open to reveal something darker. They were not simply noble warriors, defenders of Christendom, or poetic victors. They were rulers who, when faced with thousands of helpless captives, chose blood over mercy. They gambled that cruelty would make them feared, that it would secure their kingdoms and burnish their reputations. And here is the ultimate irony. They were right in their lifetimes. Their cruelty did terrify their enemies. It did make them feared. It did keep their armies safe, at least for a time. But history is patient. Centuries later, we can still see the blood they tried to hide. Because the truth is this: Richard the Lionheart and Henry V were not anomalies. They were not uniquely cruel kings who strayed from the norms of their time. They were reflections of their world. A world where power demanded violence, where mercy could be fatal, where a king's greatness was measured not only in victories won, but in how far he was willing to go to secure them. Their massacres were not accidents of history. They were the system laid bare. Richard the Lionheart and Henry V may have etched their names into history with rivers of blood, but they were far from alone. The medieval crown was not a symbol of mercy. It was a weapon. To wear it was to accept that compassion could be fatal. And so, time and again, kings and queens chose terror over tenderness, brutality over benevolence. Consider Peter of Castile, remembered by history as Peter the Cruel. His reign in the 14th century was marked by betrayal, civil war, and a paranoia that devoured even his own family. Chronicles describe him ordering executions at the slightest hint of disloyalty, sometimes forcing nobles to watch as their kin were strangled or burned alive. In one notorious episode, he lured his half-brother into a parley, promising safe conduct, only to have him butchered before his eyes. For Peter, cruelty wasn't a lapse. It was policy. It was how he reminded his court that fear could be more reliable than love. Or look to John II of France, captured by the English at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, while his captivity itself was humiliating. The deeper horror lay in what followed. To pay his ransom, France was bled dry with crushing taxes, sparking revolts and misery among his people. And when John returned to France, leaving his son behind as a hostage, he did something few could fathom. When that son tried to escape, John went back to English captivity voluntarily, a gesture of honor, but one that condemned his kingdom to further ruin. His people saw not nobility, but betrayal, a king who valued chivalric codes above the lives of his subjects, who let them suffer so he could play the knight. For many, that was a cruelty as great as any blade. But the horrors weren't only on the battlefield or in the court. They unfolded within families. Medieval royalty was plagued by betrayal between fathers, sons, brothers, and mothers. Ivan the Terrible of Russia, straddling the late medieval and early modern worlds, famously killed his own heir in a fit of rage, smashing his skull with an iron-tipped staff. The image of the Tsar cradling his dying son has haunted art and history ever since. A grotesque reminder that even the crowness bloodline was not safe from the hand that wore it. And then there is the fate of prisoners. Nameless, countless, often erased. Kings across Europe followed the same grim playbook: execute to intimidate, massacre to control. William the Conqueror, centuries before Richard, had ordered the harrying of the North, a campaign so brutal it left tens of thousands of English peasants dead, entire regions burned into wastelands. To his Norman followers, it was necessary discipline. To the people who starved in the ashes, it was apocalypse. What all these rulers understood was this: mercy was weakness. To spare prisoners, to forgive rebels, to hesitate before spilling blood. These were gambles few monarchs dared to make, for in the medieval mind, a merciful king risked being overthrown, mocked, or crushed by enemies emboldened by his hesitation. A cruel king, however, sent a clear message: cross me, and your death will not only be certain, it will be exemplary. And so, the Middle Ages became a stage for death as theater. Public executions, mass burnings, massacres of prisoners, they were not aberrations, but rituals of power. Kings knew that cruelty carved fear deeper than any sermon, and the people, whether cheering or trembling, learned to see horror as part of the natural order of monarchy. But here's the dark irony. The very kings who thought cruelty would shield them often found that it destroyed them in the end. Peter, the Cruel, was betrayed and murdered by his half-brother. Richard the Lionheart died from a common crossbow bolt, struck down not in glorious battle, but by a lowly defender of a French castle. Henry V, the supposed golden king of Agincourt, died young from dysentery. His dreams of empire rotting in his gut, their cruelty bought them fear. But it never bought them immortality. History often speaks with the voices of kings, chroniclers, and generals. But what about the prisoners themselves? The men bound at Acre, the nobles trapped at Agincourt, the peasants starved in William the Conqueror's wastelands. They left no grand chroniclers, no courtly poems, no speeches to echo through time. And yet, their silence may be the loudest voice of all. Imagine Acre in August of 1191. The air heavy with salt, the city smoldering after months of siege. Thousands of captives kneel in the dust, Saracen soldiers, merchants, women, children. They had surrendered under terms, believing their lives were spared. Some clutch each other's hands, whispering prayers in Arabic. Others stare in blank despair as the English soldiers tighten their grips on sword hilts. Then the order is given. The screams rise, the blades fall, and the ground turns red. Chroniclers say Richard's army worked for hours, methodically cutting down prisoner after prisoner, until more than 3,000 bodies lay sprawled outside the walls. What must it have felt like for those bound, waiting their turn? Each scream another reminder of the fate rushing toward them. Each breath a countdown. No chronicle captures that. But the silence afterward, the heavy, choking silence over Acre, speaks volumes. Now shift to Agincourt, 1415. The field is mud and blood, littered with corpses of French knights. The survivors, exhausted, wounded, helpless, are herded together. Some are worth fortunes in ransom. Others are lesser men, but still bound by the code of chivalry. Captivity was supposed to mean negotiation, not execution. And yet, as Henry's order rings out, the prisoners realize the truth. Mercy is gone. Imagine the chaos. The English soldiers hesitate at first. Killing unarmed prisoners went against their instincts, their culture. But when the king commands, obedience follows. Blades plunge into throats, axes fall. Mud drinks the blood of men who had once dined in glittering halls. Some try to run, only to be cut down in the muck. Others beg for their lives, shouting the names of their families, their titles, their saints. None of it matters. The massacre drowns their voices. And then, the peasants. Always forgotten, when William the Conqueror scorched the north of England in the winter of 1069, chroniclers estimate more than 100,000 people died. Villages torched, fields destroyed, livestock slaughtered. It wasn't battle, it was starvation as a weapon. Men, women, and children, huddled in the ruins of their homes, watching smoke coil into the sky. Winter crept in, and with it hunger. People ate roots, bark, even the flesh of the dead to survive. The Doomsday Book, compiled years later, still recorded vast tracts of land as waste. A silent testament to lives erased by one king's policy of terror. These are the voices history rarely records, the prisoners in line for execution. The peasants crushed under royal vengeance, the families left with nothing but grief. Kings made choices for power, strategy, and fear. But those choices were paid for in human suffering. Suffering so immense that it can barely be grasped centuries later. And here's the chilling truth. Medieval people knew this suffering intimately. For them, cruelty was not a story in a book or a tale for scholars. It was their lives. They saw kings celebrated in one breath and watched their neighbors butchered in the next. They prayed to saints, but also whispered about curses, convinced that blood soaked into the earth could never truly be washed away. We remember the kings because their names were written in gold. But the blood that ran at Acre, at Agincourt, in the harried lands of England, that belonged to people without names. People erased. People whose only memorial is the uncomfortable truth that beneath every crown lies a mountain of bones. By now, the pattern is undeniable. From Richard the Lionheart at Acre to Henry, V at Agincourt to Peter the Cruel of Castile and William the Conqueror in the north. Cruelty was not a slip of the crown, but the very foundation of medieval rule. Mercy could be admired in sermons, celebrated in saintly lives, but when it came to the brutal game of survival, cruelty was the currency kings spent most freely. The medieval monarch was more than a ruler. He was a symbol, a spectacle, and a warning. His actions were meant to resonate far beyond the battlefield or the court. A massacre was never just a massacre. It was a message. A thunderclap that told friend and foe alike. Defy me, and this is your fate. And yet, what happened after the blood dried? Here is where history becomes even more unsettling. Cruelty, once committed, did not remain raw. It was polished, shaped, retold, softened, or even erased, depending on who held the quill. Take Richard the Lionheart. Muslim chroniclers remembered him as a butcher at Acre, a man whose name stank of blood and betrayal. But within Christendom, Richard the Lionheart became the chivalric hero, a crusader knight, who dueled with Saladin in an imagined dance of honor and respect. Songs and legends painted him in gleaming armor, not as the man who ordered thousands of prisoners slaughtered in the dust. The truth was smothered beneath romance. Or Henry V for the French Agincourt was remembered as a humiliation, not just in defeat, but in dishonor. The King of England breaking chivalric custom by killing nobles who should have been spared. But for the English, the massacre melted away into the background. Chroniclers focused on the miracle of the victory. Shakespeare later immortalized Henry not as a butcher, but as a hero, delivering speeches of brotherhood and divine destiny. The prisoner's screams vanished between the lines of poetry. This rewriting was not accidental, it was deliberate. Kings commissioned chronicles, monasteries copied texts that glorified their patrons, poets reshaped events into myths, and when cruelty threatened to stain a monarch's memory, silence often covered it. But cruelty always leaves a shadow. Even when chroniclers tried to polish the image of their kings, whispers remained. A noble family in France mourning a son slain at Agincourt, never forgetting the dishonor. Muslim storytellers warning of Richard's bloodlust for generations. English peasants whose grandparents told tales of William the Conqueror's scorched earth terror, these were memories that lived on in the margins. Not in official histories, but in folklore, rumor, resentment. This duality is what makes medieval kingship so haunting. On the one hand, rulers were glorified in stone, legend, and scripture. On the other, they were feared in kitchens, marketplaces, and darkened hearths, where ordinary people whispered about their cruelty long after the chronicles turned the page. So we must ask, was cruelty simply part of being a medieval king? Could any monarch escape it? The evidence suggests no. To rule was to be cruel, or at least to be willing to be cruel when survival demanded it. Think of it as a grim bargain. A king could try to be merciful, but mercy might encourage rebellion, betrayals, or challenges. A cruel king might be hated, but he was feared. And in a world where crowns were constantly at risk of falling, fear often outlived love. What's more disturbing is how normalized this cruelty became. To modern eyes, the massacre of 3,000 prisoners or the burning of entire villages looks like a monstrous crime. To medieval eyes, it was strategy. A harsh act, yes, but one that fit within the brutal logic of the age. Cruelty was not a failure of kingship, it was its proof. And yet, centuries later, the stories we inherit are rarely about the blood. We remember Richard the Lionheart, not Richard the Butcher. We recall Henry V's band of brothers, not the mud-soaked massacre of helpless men. We know William the Conqueror as the founder of Norman England, not as the architect of famine and death in the north. This gap between reality and memory is the true legacy of medieval monarchy. Behind every shining crown is a shadow, the shadow of blood, of cruelty, of thousands of forgotten dead. And it is only when we peel back the gilded legend that we see the truth. That power in the Middle Ages was always written in red. Think back to the image we began with. A king standing above thousands of prisoners, giving the order that would turn men into corpses, the ground into a river of blood. That image is not a metaphor, not a nightmare conjured for drama. It was real. Richard the Lionheart at Acre, Henry V at Agincourt. Kings who commanded death on a scale that even their enemies struggled to comprehend. But, as we've seen, these massacres were not accidents of history. They were choices. Choices rooted in the brutal logic of medieval power. Choices that crowned cruelty as a necessity. Mercy was a gamble. Cruelty was insurance. And for centuries, rulers across Europe paid their debts in blood. What makes this story chilling is not just the violence itself, but the way it was remembered, or more often, forgotten. How many people today know Richard as the hero of crusading ballads, not the Butcher of Acre? How many cheer Henry V's rousing speeches without ever hearing of the noble prisoners hacked to death in the mud of Agincourt? How many recall William the Conqueror as the founder of Norman England, not the man who burned the north into famine? History tells us what it wants us to hear, but the ground still holds the truth. The fields where prisoners screamed, the ruins of villages turned to ash, the nameless bones buried without marker, they remained silent witnesses to a reality we are only now beginning to confront. And here is the deeper horror. These kings were celebrated, not condemned. Their cruelty did not end their reigns. It secured them. Richard was idolized for centuries. Henry became a national hero, immortalized by Shakespeare himself. Even Peter the Cruel, hated in his time, was later rebranded by some chroniclers as Peter the Just. Time erodes the blood, but it polishes the crown. What does that say about us? About the stories we choose to keep alive? Do we admire strength so much that we will excuse atrocity? Do we crave legends so deeply that we forget the corpses beneath them? In the end, the horrific deaths of medieval kings and queens, and the horrors they inflicted, are two sides of the same coin. The rulers, who died in grotesque ways, burned, poisoned, betrayed, were part of a world where cruelty was both weapon and punishment, both policy and destiny. Their ends were as bloody as their reigns, as if the crown itself demanded payment in suffering. The Middle Ages remind us that power has always walked hand in hand with brutality. And when we look at the glittering myths, the Lionheart, the warrior king of Agincourt, the conquerors and crusaders, we must remember the silence behind them. The silence of thousands of forgotten dead, erased by ink, overshadowed by gold. So the next time you hear the tale of a great king, ask yourself, whose blood bought that greatness? Whose screams were silenced to build the legend? And how many of those bones still lie under the fields we call history? Because behind every crown, behind every monument, behind every shining story of glory, there is always blood. And it is the blood, not the crown, that tells the truest story of power.